In my game Vlogum, I decided to implement a weapon wheel since the player would come across multiple weapons. There are quite a few weapon wheel tutorials for Unreal, but practically all of them are for a procedural wheel with the style from GTA. And while GTA's wheel is great, I felt that it just wouldn't fit my game style. In order to find a style that I would like for my game, I used a fantastic website that helps with getting inspiration for UI design. There are two websites that I recommend if you are trying to figure out your UI design. One website is Game UI Database and the other is Interface in Game. These are two websites with a collection of bunch of UI layouts, animations, and they have videos, GIFs, pictures, whatever you need to kind of find that inspiration or reference for your own UI. Now that I had an idea of what I wanted my weapon wheel to look like, I went to Figma and started creating the wheel. At this moment, I wasn't focused on any of the functionality or coding aspect and just wanted to see if the style I had in mind would fit. It took a few iterations, but then I was finally able to settle on this design, which I was happy with, and you may recognize where the inspiration came from. Now comes the challenging part, making the wheel actually work. To start off, I separated each segment of the wheel to be its own widget. Each segment would be a checkbox to later allow me to deselect other segments that were not selected. Once I had the style for each instance of the checkbox, i.e. selected, unselected, and hovering, I was now ready to lay the segments out into a wheel pattern. Now, there might be a much better way to implement this, but I wouldn't be able to tell you how. I had originally found this article that showed how to lay widgets in a circle, which would have been fantastic if the shape of my segment was more even, but I was unsuccessful in my situation. Eventually, I just had to lay them out by hand. So at this point, I have a weapon wheel that you could select and unselect as well as show its hovering state, but as you can see, you can select more than one segment, which is not what we want. In order to get the wheel to function properly, I'll begin the coding for the user widgets. Like I had mentioned earlier, the easiest way for this is to have two separate user widgets. One is a widget of a single segment and the other user widget will be the actual weapon wheel. Let's start by going into the wheel segment widget. Now, in its graph, I'll create an event dispatcher named uncheckAll. I'll give it two parameters. One, a boolean value called isChecked, and the second, an object reference of wheel segment widget. This will allow me to identify the check state of the checkbox and reference itself later in the weapon wheel widget. Now, I'll set the dispatcher to be called whenever the checkbox's check state changes. And that'll be all I need to do in this widget. Moving into the weapon wheel widget, you'll see in the hierarchy I have a canvas and underneath that 6 wheel segments. Let's head into the graph. We'll start off by bringing in the wheel canvas variable and getting all its children. I'll then run it into a for each loop so that we can have each child cast to the wheel segment and have each of them bind to the dispatch event uncheckAll. With this, we'll create a custom event that will pull the selected segment variable and then use the checkbox's enum value to see if its state is checked or unchecked. If the checkbox is unchecked, we want to go ahead and set the inIsChecked value to true. However, if the state is checked, it'll need to do one of two options based on if this is the first time a segment has been selected or not. For this, I'll create a variable named lastSelected, and its variable type will be a wheel segment widget. We'll then run an isValid based on this variable. The first pass of this node will not be valid, so it'll need to be set after the checkbox gets selected. and now that checkbox will become the last selected variable. Once there is a valid last selected variable, it will then become unchecked. Okay, let's see this in action and confirm it's all working. Right now, there are no selected segments, so when I click on a segment, it will set its value to checked and then call the binded event of unchecked others. This custom event will then run and see that the selected segment has the state of checked and will validate the last selected variable. Since it won't be valid, it will set this selected segment as the last selected variable. Then, when I select a new segment, it will follow the same path, except this time there is a valid last selected. So it will then get the last selected segment and change it to false for the in is checked state. Now we can't have two segments selected at once. If I select the same segment, its state will become unchecked, but once the binded event runs, it will set its state to true for in is checked. Now we have a weapon wheel that can properly toggle between the segments. With this part completed, it's time for the logic of changing the character's weapon when a segment is selected. I started off by just setting a way for the weapon to be unequipped when I pressed a key, and it worked. Sort of. Yeah, I'll fix that later. Next, I want to be able to switch weapons with the press of a key, so I create an array for the player's weapons. Once the weapon is collected, it will be added to the array, and now with the press of a key, we can cycle through the weapons. Although I won't be using the entirety of this section of the code, it does give me a clear path to implement what I do need. With that being said, I need to relay the weapon switch whenever the segment is selected. To implement this, I create an instance editable variable inside the wheel segment called weapon name, which allows me to name it inside the weapon wheel widget. To make use of that variable, I'll have the widget get the variable of the player character to pass the named weapon to the player's blueprint. I'll follow that up with creating a custom event called equip selected with the input of weapon name. I'll get the UFO and call its function called equip selected weapon. Next, I'll need to make this custom event run whenever the segment is selected, so I'll put equip selection after the checked state enum. Also, here's what the equip selected function looks like in the player character. Sweet, we now have the weapon toggling between selection, but that's unfortunately not the end. First, I need to fix that pesky bug and make this work with the player controller as well, which, if my research proves to be true, this will be a massive pain. Next stop, hell, I guess. Yay.